Good afternoon. This is Admiral Mike Studeman. I am the Director of Intelligence at the Indo-Pacific Command in Oahu, Hawaii. The Director of Intelligence, otherwise known as the J2 position, is the one that I've been filling for about a year and a half now. I wanted to thank from the get-go former Director of National Intelligence and Admiral Michael Studeman and the Florida Center for Cybersecurity for inviting me to speak at this conference. I wish I could do it virtually and be available for questions and answers, but unfortunately my schedule will only allow me to do a pre-recording, so I'm doing this about 2 weeks ahead of your actual conference. So thanks for your flexibility and patience. I've been asked to talk a little bit about China and a little bit about cyber. I'll read the actual questions I got that will frame some of my remarks today. Hopefully you'll find this useful. I thought I'd start by just describing that in the Indo-Pacific we have a fairly large region that we are responsible for. So we have 36 nations in this AOR. That accounts for about 60% of the world's GDP and about half of the world's population, and those numbers are going to go up over the next few years. We also describe our zone of responsibility from Hollywood to Bollywood, if you're looking east-west. And if you're looking north-south, we talk about polar bears to penguins. And so that's our region, that's what we're responsible for. In this particular stretch of the earth and the ocean, we find that you have 7 of the 10 largest militaries. You have 6 nuclear powers. You have 5 of our defense treaty allies are here, of the 7 total that we have. And we have lots of activity. If you look at the so-called red actors, and you count up what some people would describe as the 2+3 or the 2+2+1, we have many of those actors here. So we have the Chinese, the Russians, DPRK, we have some extent of interaction with Iran, but that's less than obviously the Middle East and other parts of the world. And we have the violent extremist organizations here. So we cover down on many of the top threats to U.S. national security. So that's our remit, and that's what we're responsible for, and hopefully I can add something of value with regard to some of these threat actors, particularly on the cyber front. I think what you'll end up finding is that I'll do a little bit of coverage on Russia and DPRK and spend the balance of my time really on the China account. Before we get there, I'd like to just ensure that you know that one of the visions that we have out here is for a free and open Indo-Pacific. And I thought I would cite what we mean by free and open, because this is really important context in terms of contrasting with the notions about the way that the future of the world should be shaped by our competitors that are out there, notably Russia and China. So when we talk about a free and open, we define this in terms of, in free, that term, obviously it applies to traditional security, but here we talk about that in terms of values as well as political systems. So in our parlance here, we talk about free societies that respect the individual rights and liberties. We talk about the promotion of good governance throughout, and the adherence to the shared values that are captured in the United Nations and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. When we talk about free, we also talk about the freedom that nations have to be able to choose who they partner with and who they trade with without fear or coercion as they carry out the business of their own sovereign and secure rights to operate as independent nations. When we talk about open, we talk about having the ability to use the international commons and have unfettered access to the seas and the airways upon which people and these nations depend for their security and their prosperity. And in this theater, we also stretch that word to mean that it's also that nations are able to have open investment environments where they can have transparent agreements with one another, and that they protect their intellectual property, and they have free, fair, and reciprocal trade. So this is the way that we define the vision for the Indo-Pacific, and I would just tell you the reason we have to call this out and we have to talk about it is because it is under assault by others who have a different vision for how to sculpt the future of the 21st century. So the questions that I got here will help frame how I approach the discussion today. I was asked, talk about what do we need to be on alert for from the Indo-Pacific. How should we, as a nation, be planning and preparing to deal with threats from a national security standpoint, factoring critical infrastructure, private industry issues. As a corollary here, we're interested in the perspective on goals, strategies, and tactics of our adversaries, and their approach in using cyberspace. What are we going to see in the future, and how should we prepare to respond? And so I'll attempt to answer these questions as I run through my spiel here. I would just say that it's probably worth doing a quick executive summary of the threat actors first as it relates to cyber, and just scratch that itch in the beginning, and then maybe we can get into a deeper conversation about China. When I take a look at Russia, I hear often that it is the most sophisticated cyber threat and challenge that we have out there. Russia, as you know, is often described as a spoiler, distractor, a source of influence operations, and all that is true. With Russia, I think that it's helpful to see that there is a scale factor where the Russians operate more surgically when we're comparing them to the Chinese, and they have more finite capabilities and resources in some respects. The Russian influence campaigns that use cyber as an enabler are clear, I think, to most who are readers of the news, and so I may not have to go too deeply into it, but it's worth saying that in this region and in other regions, that the Russians are here to clearly find ways to reduce American power and to reduce pressure on Russia to give them a more free and open hand and more maneuver space. And so that comes with the Russians deciding that one way to deal with that is to keep the United States distracted with many internal problems, and it helps them immensely to have the polarization that you see in American society today, the ability for them to amplify divisions through the use of social media, and to contribute to the general fracas that exists out there, to be able to keep us divided and to keep us from cohering, so that we can actually come together united to govern ourselves and to focus on, in fact, external things. If our energies are consumed internal to the United States, then we have less energy and time and space to focus them outward on foreign policy objectives. And so this is clearly in the strategic national interest of the Russians to keep us internally occupied with many different things that in fact make it very difficult for us to come together and make decisions and move out. If I'm looking at the DPRK, it's a different caliber kind of threat, particularly when we start talking about cyber. They're more of a moderate cyber capability in general. We find that their activities are targeted for specific things. Part of it is, of course, espionage, as in all red opponents, what they do. A lot of that also, though, is related to revenue. So you wouldn't be surprised to see that the DPRK would be out there doing a combination of things. In some respects, they're collecting on other people's industrial bases, trying to get insights that will contribute to their ballistic missile and their nuclear programs, and that at the same time they might use that insight to build their R&D base, but also maybe even try to sell those insights to other partners that may be interested in that knowledge and to get some revenue out of it as well. You've seen DPRK try to penetrate banks, sometimes successfully, and to be able to go after other things that contribute to essentially a very criminalized, approach to generating revenue for their motherland. In 2014, we saw the DPRK used cyber capabilities as a political tool to be able to retaliate on so many pictures, and so there are those capabilities here that you might see in the future depending on other conditions, but obviously more rarely practiced. In the case of China, China in every respect is far more consequential, including on the cyber front. And so when you're talking about the sheer scope and scale of their actions and their capabilities, you're in a different region altogether here. The Chinese have been able to successfully organize. 5 or 6 years ago, they did a number of different reforms that were very, very significant on the equivalent of our 1947 National Security Act, and were able to reorganize their theaters. They focused on building a strategic support force. Underneath that, there is a cybersecurity force, and that cybersecurity force is able to, in fact, bring together not only their capabilities, but in concert with upper echelons and others to their left and right, the cyber, the space, the electronic warfare, and to some extent the influence operations and propaganda and disinformation into a coherent capability that reduces some of the barriers and integrates in a way that allows them to get the full power of these disciplines. And so that has been the Chinese organizational approach here, where the cyber forces play a very significant role in enabling China in all respects, and contributes to all of their comprehensive national power goals. In the case of Russia and China, where their goals overlap, of course, is in being able to hold our critical infrastructure at risk for all the reasons that you know well. And so both of them have penetrated and do have purchase in critical areas within the United States, and based on their doctrine and their writings and their intent, we see that they are, under certain conditions, absolutely ready to be able to pull the trigger on holding that critical infrastructure at risk and shutting down lights, going after electricity, gas, water, you name it. Those are the kinds of things that that our major strategic competitors are prepared to do, and it is just part of what they would term their strategic deterrence capability. Okay, I'm going to shift gears here after just running through in an executive fashion, having hit those 3 red actors with cyber capabilities in our theater, and spend a little more time on China. So the reason why we do this is because it's a bigger strategic challenge. In fact, it is a challenge that is the greatest to the United States in the 21st century and probably beyond. And so what is the nature of this threat? Why do we need to think about it? I think you're going to get a plenary that will focus on some of these things, and hopefully this aligns. If I say something wrong, your subject matter experts at that plenary can probably clean it up somewhat, but I'm going to give you my take on this. So when we take a look at the overarching goal for the Chinese, they've set out 2049 as the rejuvenation of the motherland. And in that case, they have different milestones to be able to achieve that goal. When you take a look at certain years, they'll cite 2035 for certain things they'd like to get done. They've talked about 2025 for certain things. Made in China for a while is 2025, and advanced modernized military by 2035. They've actually accelerated some of these goals, and this is one of the disturbing things that we see about the Chinese today, that they're very opportunistic, and they have read the international environment, and they take a look, and they have in fact seen opportunity for them to advance their case faster. And so recently they held a National People's Congress, and it looks like they accelerated their 2035 timeline for advanced modernized capabilities to 2027, which is very disturbing and telling for us about what their intent might be to use those armed forces, for. When you hear the Chinese, you'll often hear the mantra that the East is rising and the West is declining. And you'll hear that parroted by many others going forward. The Chinese have a view of the future in which they will supplant the United States as the leading power on the planet, right? So they take a look at U.S. power and they see danger. They see us as a destabilizing, provocative power that cannot be trusted, which is unpredictable, which is the cause for most of the major conflicts that have roiled different parts of the planet. That is their perspective here. They see that their strategic interests lie in maneuvering to end up being the strongest pole in a multipolar world, reducing what has been, the unipolar superpower with the United States being dominant in most of international geopolitics. This idea of supplanting the United States here is followed closely by this idea that it should be done under conditions where the Chinese will talk about various things like the community of common destiny for mankind. In other words, a harmonious community of nations that it moves forward together, clearly in the Chinese mind, under what they would describe as their own concepts, rules, standards, protocols for how nations behave, etc. And so the Chinese myth that we often hear is that they intend to become simply a regional power and to dominate Asia. And the answer to that assertion is that yes, and it is clearly dominating in Asia, but it is far more expansive in terms of the Chinese dream, which is to be on the ascendant and be at the center and to have the greatest throw weight among nations as the future unfolds. So we take a look at this and go, what is the challenge? Kissinger has outlined the challenge by saying that he thinks that we're in the foothills of a new Cold War because of the nature of the kind of competition that we see that's about to ensue. The reality check on this is that the Chinese have actually been engaged in this struggle for ascendancy for many decades here. We are only now the sleeping giant that is sort of rubbing its eyes and waking up into the idea that it in fact has been grappled with and been pulled and tugged for many, many different years, and the wrestling match has been underway for quite some time. And this is our challenge as a nation, is to achieve further awakening and enlightenment so that we can actually deal with the brutal facts of our existence. So if we were to recognize that China is trying to take the commanding heights of the global economy, what would we do? If we were to realize that the Belt and Road Initiative and some of the other initiatives by the Chinese did not have simply benign flavors to it, what would we do? And so that's our place right now, is awakening to the sense that we need to mobilize for action here and not be seduced by the dulcet words that come out of Xi Jinping. So when we describe China here, often we have to take a more pejorative view than we would like, but it happens to be the reality in describing China's rise. Because when we look at the manifestations and we detail them out, we see a country that is in fact trying to make the world safe for authoritarianism, and we see a country that is undermining the existing world order. And we support that with a number of different things. So I'll list out kind of some of the big chunks of this, and maybe we can go into some of the IT implications of some of these areas. So for example, we talk about the concern that we have about the Chinese abetting global corruption here. We see this all over the map with their corruption of business and political elites. It's been one of the key enablers for them to be able to successfully implement their Belt and Road Initiative. We see the oppressive surveillance and the cyber monitoring and the internal control tools that are not just used internal to China, but have a massive marketing campaign associated with them, with many takers across the world now. We see the erosion of freedoms, and we see the failure to honor agreements from the Chinese. We see the persecution of minorities, and we see how they deal with state enemies, which we can talk about a little bit more. We see the threatening neighbors factor, which I do want to talk about because it speaks to their assertiveness. The disregard for international norms and standards. The environmental destruction and the overfishing and going to other EEZs, and the sheer rapaciousness of the Chinese intent to go after resources. The overseas access that they are enabling and trying to expand to enable their own power projection capabilities to protect all of their lifelines that will extend globally around the planet. The economic coercion and the predatory lending practices that are variously called neo-mercantilist by some, have other names by others. We're getting into some of the other areas here that you care more about in this conference, and that of course relates to the wide-scale and persistent intellectual property theft. To some extent, when we talk about how cyber also enables the propaganda and the disinformation and the United Front activities that you see that they have. They've applied the same tools they use for controls around information inside the country, and are now extending them outward here, sometimes successfully, sometimes not, but still very robustly. We're all aware of creating international entities that are alternative ones to ones that have been set up, and then the co-option of international institutions from the inside out, taking over key spots, putting their people in, and then beginning to change rule sets, standards, etc. from the inside. All this is very disturbing because if you take a look at some of their adherence to some of the pre-existing, rule sets, it could be WTO regulations and laws and how they do not apply those, in their own practices. So pretending to be inside the legitimate systems and yet not adhering to those and doing whatever it takes to advance their country's objectives. These are the disturbing manifestations of China's rise altogether. So, what are the impacts for those? I think we have a number here. When we take a look at the geopolitical framework, it's very disturbing to see where the Chinese have been able to capitalize on all of these behaviors to advance their comprehensive national strength. We take a look at their modernization. If there was a myth about the Chinese only wanting to have regional preeminence, there's another myth regarding that the Chinese only have a modest investment in their military. If you take a look at their budget, it's announced as $210 billion a year. You can easily, take my word for it as an intel officer, you can easily double that and not get to the real budget. At the same time, you can take a look and understand that a given dollar in the PRC with the purchasing power parity goes much farther than a given dollar in the United States. You should be looking at the military modernization as a wide open throttle from the Chinese, and one in which they have been able to capitalize on their access to our intellectual property to fuel one of the fastest rises of any military in any segment or era of history going forward. If it were benign and there were purposes that would simply be defensive, that would be one thing. But the challenge is that this rapid rise has also occurred at the same time that the Chinese confidence has grown tremendously. And we're seeing this confidence translate into all of the border issues. These are long-standing issues, but the Chinese have been incredibly assertive here because they feel like the tide is turning in their favor. They feel like there are fewer nations that are willing to push back on them because they have so much economic leverage over them. And so that's our trouble when we take a look at the Chinese strategy. Is this assertiveness, this confidence is growing to degrees where we will see more and more challenges and more willingness to use power, raw power, hard, sharp, soft as necessary to be able to promote Chinese objectives. And so an example, we can walk through the line of actual control on the border with India and China and take a look at the changes that the Chinese did on the border that created that crisis, and one that still persists and has a strategic nature associated with it. The Chinese probably overplayed their hand there. The Indians clearly have warmed to us to a degree that we've probably never seen in the past, and so we have opportunity there. But the Chinese will continue to prioritize what they call their core sovereignty issues, and in that zone they think they have some there too, and they're not willing to so-called give up an inch of territory there. And so that's one of many areas, and we can just keep walking down through the other ones. If we go west to east, we walk into Xinjiang very quickly, and we see what it's like when the Chinese have full control. And we see the oppression with the Uyghurs, the abuses there. Genocide does count as the description if you're sterilizing your minorities. Very sad. The stories have come out. There's plenty of evidence of what the Chinese are doing there, and it's truly of the order of Big Brother. We're seeing that too if you just work further away, your way to the southeast and talk about Hong Kong and the death of Hong Kong's freedoms. The one country, two systems model that existed is no more. And the Hong Kong people have essentially been removed from any form of political power there. The national security law and their approach has shut down the life and the freedoms and the values that used to thrive in Hong Kong. And this is one of the most stark examples of what China will do when they get additional controls. The South China Sea is always a challenge. As you know, the militarization of the islets down there has been occurring for years, and it continues today. If you looked at what they've been able to put on the reclaimed areas there, it would boggle your mind, but they continue to slowly, gradually creep and advance with different capabilities. Yesterday it was runways and barracks and hangars and antennas and storage areas. The next day it's the actual aircraft. The next day it's electronic warfare equipment. Then you have surface-to-air missiles and coastal defense cruise missiles. There'll be fighters down there eventually in the South China Sea. This is the nature of China's creeping advances, all probably aptly described as gray zone tactics to be able to change the facts on the ground. They're moving out. They're just moving slowly and carefully and methodically. The same is true when we take a look at a place like the Senkakus. The Senkakus, an area that the Japanese clearly claim that we have identified as within the Mutual Defense Treaty. That does not change the way that the Chinese have begun to move their Chinese Coast Guard in, spending longer duration time in there, trying to get more jurisdictional control over the Senkakus. Steady, slow pressure over time, right? The same kind of tactics that apply in almost every area of China's approaches. You're seeing it here physically, but also occurring in other zones. The pressure on Taiwan is intense right now, with flights near daily in the southwest part of Taiwan, around the backside of Taiwan, all designed to penalize, shape, and influence the thing that I don't like anything that the Chinese are offering here. And so we do think that Taiwan is a democracy that will end up being as threatened within this decade as Hong Kong was over the last year plus. And so we need to factor that in all of our planning as we go forward. You've heard, perhaps if you look at my commander's testimony to Congress, our concerns about where Taiwan goes. So this is the nature of the Chinese approach, with the boldness and the assertiveness and the confidence that's growing. When we start talking about how this translates into the cyber area, it's very clear that the Chinese are on the march. They are capitalizing on our softness and the easy targets that we present to them, and they're happy to drive right through our vulnerabilities. At the same time, they're not making the same mistake, and they've done all of the hardening that perhaps an autocratic government can do easier, but they're doing all the hardening behind the Great Wall there in China, and making it very difficult for an opponent to do the kinds of things that they are clearly doing to us. What does it mean for us? When we take a look at the amount of, let's just say, the intellectual property theft. This crowd is probably more steeped in the figures here than any other, but if your GDP is around 1% less every year because of cyber theft, it should probably motivate us to do something more than what we have. If you're losing $600 billion in and around per annum because of the things that are going out the door, then it's time to bolt the door better. And so this is not just a financial or an academic dynamic. This is this hemorrhage of American intellectual property year in, year out for a decade plus has enabled China to create this massive military that you see today. America is responsible in part, maybe a large part, for the ability for the Chinese not to go down R&D rat holes, to be able to quickly understand what technology is viable and works, and to incorporate it, and to be able to commercialize it, very quickly, and to create high volume amounts of the most advanced and lethal capabilities. And so we take a look and go, where does that IP end up? It ends up in the very assets that are doing the coercion and the pressuring and the challenging, in the key areas here in the Western Pacific. Our boss tells us that the fault line of the international order is essentially the first island chain. What happens here and how some of these problems will be resolved, whether they're Taiwan or issues with the South China Sea and the claimants, or with Japan, how these things are resolved will dictate really what the nature of the balance of power looks like in the 21st century. They have to be the starkest examples of how the Chinese will be able to move forward with their capabilities. And so that's the stakes that we see here in this particular region. And so if you were able to look at the PLA and see what our lack of security has enabled, you will find this massive array of stuff that presents a genuine problem and a peer, not a near peer, a peer challenge to the U.S. military. And you could go through and you could start with talking about the PLA Navy and say it's the largest Navy in the world. Not by tonnage, but by numbers. And with numbers, they have lots of different missile capabilities on their platforms. Take a look at the advanced submarines that they've been able to produce with weaponry that has very, very long ranges. You take a look at the ballistic missile force, the largest in the world, the one that's more active in live fires, the one that's advancing more quickly when it comes to hypersonics and some of the other features of advanced missile systems. If you take a look at the electronic warfare deck that they have, if you take a look at the space capabilities when they're launching 40 to 90 spacecraft a year, and what that does is they thicken up their C5ISR. If you walk down all the capability areas, right, from anti-satellite to electromagnetic railgun to quantum computing to artificial intelligence to all the military hardware, that stuff is fresh, young, ready to go capability today to be used for the purposes that I outlined for you earlier, which is the most disturbing element of where the Chinese are going, right? And so those are the stakes here, and it's not an exaggeration to say that the global balance of power has shifted significantly in China's favor because of our inability on the cyber front to square our house away. And that's one of the implications. There are other implications here that I'd like to touch on that go beyond that. When we think about China's ability to sell its cheaper IT globally and get access to most nations out there that have Chinese-made ICT, that enables them to essentially have the penetration to be able to then get massive amounts of big data, right? And if you think about who's going to win in the big data field and how that will contribute to your ability to support artificial intelligence and machine learning capability, those that actually have more big data sources that can run those through the mill are able to do quicker machine learning and then to be able to identify and sharpen their understanding of a host of different things across every kind of sector that you have, right? And that will improve all of the Chinese instruments of national power. And we will one day look back and wonder how the Chinese knew that, or why the Chinese one or two steps ahead. How are the Chinese able to go in that place and do that thing before I could tie my shoelaces? Right? That will come because they will have an information advantage of gigantic proportions because of their already impressive ICT penetration and their laws which require their companies to share that data, that if anybody in their intelligence services wants to get that data, they have to provide it if you're a Chinese company. And so when we talk a lot about the dangers associated with contracting Chinese companies like Huawei and ZTE, this is what we are talking about. And then you will find that when you absorb these things, that the Chinese will have a very strengthened capability to do intelligence and counterintelligence. The ability to use this information to identify precise points of leverage within foreign companies and foreign nations, their political elite, their business elite, their military elite. With that knowledge, they're able to tailor their operations to go precisely to the points of leverage that enable them to have influence and to shape decisions in their favor. We might be surprised to find that there are more nations in the future, because of these tactics, that aren't willing to sign up for U.S. and allied initiatives because they'll be hedging. They'll be hedging because they have to, because they're beholden to a certain degree because of the way the Chinese are able to have them dead by rights. And so this is one of the implications for us as we look forward to a future where the IT domain is one in which there is a massive struggle for influence, and the person who has the advantage has a tremendous advantage over the next place. Another implication as we take a look at the cyber challenges is the idea that our ally systems and their infosec, if compromised, if penetrated, then puts a wedge between our ability to work with them on a whole range of issues. If you can't trust them with a plan because the plan could be exposed to an adversary, then you don't get to have all the cycle time on working out your contingencies and what you're going to do, and you're going to be less good at that when push comes to shove. And so this idea of the impact on our partners because their information security is compromised is a major thing that is on our mind when we talk about our allies out here. We think about how market share will be advanced in China's favor because they have insights that allow them to then develop technologies which are more attractive, and with the state subsidies to be able to, in fact, be able to underbid any competitors. This poses an additional economic and financial danger for companies that are looking at what their place will be in the information ecosystem in the future. And so, if left unchecked, don't be surprised that U.S. and European companies will get less market share over time because they just can't stay competitive against the Chinese juggernaut. So let me try to address this one area here about what to do about it. And in this case, I'm just going to be somewhat of a parrot. I have led a command that dealt with cyber, the Joint Intelligence Operations Center at Cybercom. I was honored to lead a few years ago, and I was also the commanding officer of a Navy Information Services Center. That did not make me a master of anything, and I consider myself a perpetual journeyman when it comes to cyber matters. But I've been impressed by a number of writings, and I'm hoping that Melissa Hathaway and MIT's John Mallory are part of your conference there, because I think they provide real value. When I think about what they describe here, I do believe John Mallory has it right, that the wellspring and the ground zero, which requires the most focus, is at the architectural design level, which means going back to the drawing board in many cases to be able to, rethink exactly what the ICT architecture needs to be. You can put it under the modernize or evolve or whatever you talk about, but until we get to that architectural redesign, then we still have the very real situation that the existing ICT tech plane is insecurable and it's indefensible. And so kudos to all of the cyber defenders who are out there in the public and the private sectors who are doing God's work trying to defend that space, but it is fundamentally indefensible given the nature of the vulnerabilities that are there. I agree with John Mallory's description of this idea that the profit motive is driving the kinds of designs that are allowed to in fact be embedded with vulnerability and risk, and then that risk is then handed on downstream, to other companies and other entities there, right? That's just sort of the reality of the kind of software that we have to deal with. So I do think there are first things first, and the architectural elements are there. The idea that companies are relatively free from liability, I think is a problem. And I know there are lots of discussions about cyber insurance or ways to hold companies accountable. I believe there should be some kind of branding or reputational cost that's associated with having less secure cyber capabilities there. There are better minds than mine that have looked at that, but I do think that there's a there there. The self-regulation piece has proven not to be effective. We've had a quarter century of industry having a chance to regulate. So what amount of regulation is required clearly has been the debate within Congress, and they have clearly focused on some areas there. But I do think that the balanced and proportional amount of regulation will be required to go forward. The idea that we need higher standards for security and resilience is an idea that resonates here. It fundamentally equates to what we talk about within Indo-PACOM, which relates to essentially fighting hurt. In other words, you're not truly ready for your war plans and your contingencies unless you have thought through exactly what it takes to fight with damage and destruction that has wrecked your system of systems here. So a key attribute of agility and adaptability, those are the kinds of things that I think are going to mark a better future for us. That comes with an acute self-awareness of exactly how you've been hit and what exactly has happened to you. And so that requires a level of fidelity and granularity that sometimes escapes us, to know yourself as well as you know anything else. It also comes with a sense of the risks, having an acute sense of your risk that you are taking and whether or not you can afford that or not. And that's one of those things where metrics can assist to a point. And so I do think that this notion of resilience is something that ought to be thought about. The duty to warn issue is a significant one. And I think there has been an elevated level of sharing from what I've been able to pick up on over the years that has changed somewhat, but there's still many ways that companies feel inhibited from sharing the fact that they've been breached there. But this idea that we should in fact mandate the breaches to the federal government of certain networks, I think has cachet. And I think that there's an executive order that President Biden is considering on this. I think it would actually go some way in helping us make sure that we have indications and warning of a threat that then can be shared and dealt with as soon as possible to limit the damage to other members of our private and public security environments. The IT standards that the Chinese are trying to influence, I think requires us, if we're doing a list of things to work on, to step out and be able to be there where it counts to shape those IT standards so that you don't find that the Chinese have set the lowest common denominator and those standards work for the kind of ICT that they're creating. So being involved in those discussions, shaping and influencing those to make sure that the standards are what we know to be better and more appropriate and line up with what would be acceptable, I think, is part and parcel of what we would need to do as we think about a prescriptive approach to dealing with the challenge. We also need to be able to understand that helping ourselves is not just good enough. What we do in our outreach to our partners is also, very critical because we have codependencies, and unfortunately, sometimes you're only as strong as your weakest link. So I would offer up those ideas. I don't think any of them are new, but I would just validate that I think some of them that have been discussed are probably on the right track. So to conclude, I just want to say that I wish in this session that I could have painted a more benign and a less worrisome picture for you, particularly about the Chinese, but I can't in good conscience do that. On my side, I have access to almost everything that we have that's sensitive in nature classified about the Chinese, whether it's their grand strategy, their goals, their intent, their behaviors, their activities. And I would just tell you that what I described here is not alarmist and hyperbole. It's right down the middle, giving you kind of the straight scoop. If we don't recognize this challenge for what it is, and I think there's more of an awareness piece that we need to do here, my feeling is that it's going to be too late. The East will have risen, and the West will have declined, and unforgivably, it would have been by our own hand because of our failure to act. I personally think that it's going to be the accumulation of of a lot of small decisions and small acts that will enable us to go in the right direction. And so everybody's involvement in this way, working as a team and being united, at least on these dire security threats, will get us moving forward. I think we have some constructs. Ms. Newberg has clearly taken charge. You got good leaders in Congress that are trying to make a difference, but it comes down to individual actions everywhere across the landscape of the United States. So when I think about who's listening in on this conference, I have great confidence that it's going to be this group that's going to be able to make great strides moving forward. So thank you again for a chance just to deliver a few perspectives from my end all the way out here in the middle of the Pacific. I wish you the best of luck, and thank you again for allowing me a small amount of time to discuss the issues. Indo-Pacific, signing off.